All right. So, a couple things. This is second to last week of lectures, so there are only 5 full lectures left. Friday next week is going to be our normal review day before an exam, so we just have to get up through Wednesday. The content of these last several lectures, I kind of just stretched it out so that they were a little bit more compartmentalized, so like function versus regulation. But that means each lecture has a little bit less content, so I don't expect these last several lectures to be super long. But if you have any other questions or have clarification, feel free to ask me. I'll do my best. Also, I am suffering from something blooming right now. Something is allergies. I'm not used to it. I'm new to Kansas. I think it might be cottonwoods, but I am sneezing and my eyes are itchy, so if the recording gets interrupted, I apologize. I also realized just now that I duplicated a number on the lectures. Friday's was 34. This is also 34. I'll fix that after class. Not that it's a big deal, but just in case you're following along, I will get that fixed. All right, so today we are going to talk about reproductive function. So how do we actually go about fertilizing an egg? What is the process? What is going to be happening? We're going to start with the female reproductive system. There's a lot more going on with the female reproductive system. There's a lot more steps. There's a lot more individual pieces. So this is going to be a majority of today's lecture, and then we'll round it off with the male system at the very end. So the purpose of sexual reproduction is, of course, to fertilize an egg. And the egg is going to be released during a process we call ovulation. So this is when the secondary oocyte, remember that's the proper term for the egg. It's not the primary. The primary is before that first division. So the secondary oocyte is an egg that is ready to be fertilized, and it is released from the ovary. So we're creating these oocytes within the ovary upon ovulation. 1, usually, occasionally 2, and in very, very rare circumstances, more than 2 can be released, but that's, again, not a common occurrence, will be released into the end of the fallopian tube. Now, it doesn't immediately pass through the fallopian tube. It actually will hang out for a couple of days, kind of right at the very beginning part of the fallopian tube. And while it's staying there, it's waiting to be fertilized. So it won't actually move along through the rest of the fallopian tube until either it's past its stage of fertility, so it doesn't get fertilized, or it becomes fertilized and then it will start passing through the fallopian tube. So the fertilization actually occurs kind of right at the very end of the fallopian tube, right next to the ovary. When we talked about structure and anatomy, I talked about the layers of your eggs, and remember, your developing oocyte is going to be surrounded by these cells, these follicle cells, that are going to be helping to sustain that egg until it becomes fertilized, and then again through the very, very beginning stages of pregnancy. These are going to be what's providing the nutrients to the egg until the placenta forms from the mother. So we have a oocyte that's developing. As that oocyte gets larger, so do the follicle cells around it. So the entire structure of the follicle plus oocyte is increasing in size. At the stage of ovulation, once the egg is ready to be released, the follicle ruptures. That oocyte is then expelled into the fallopian tube. The follicle then reseals itself and forms a brand new structure that we haven't talked about. This is called the corpus luteum. It literally means yellow package. It's yellow in color. And this turns into essentially an endocrine gland. Its job, after it has released its oocyte, is to secrete the hormone progesterone, which is a hormone that's going to help sustain pregnancy, especially in the very early stages. So it's releasing progesterone in the hopes that the oocyte that it just expelled becomes fertilized, and then this will help sustain that fertilized egg during those initial phases of division until the placenta is formed. Without fertilization, so if the oocyte does not become fertilized, the corpus luteum just withers. It will shrink in size until it gets completely recycled by the body, and then the cycle will start over again. So it's kind of a revolving door of growing follicle and oocyte. Oocyte is ovulated, follicle becomes corpus luteum, corpus luteum withers, goes away, start the cycle over again. Now, the female reproductive system has 2 cycles. You often confuse these if it's not something you talk about regularly. We have an ovarian cycle, which has to do with what's happening with the follicle, the oocyte. And then we also have the uterine cycle, which is specifically what's happening with the layers of the uterus. So there are 2 separate cycles we're going to go through, starting with the ovarian cycle. This cycle, which I just kind of went through, is the phase of increasing follicle and oocyte size, ovulation, and then what remains of the corpus luteum, whether or not it's being used or it's going to wither. That process of growing our oocyte, ovulating, and becoming an endocrine gland is approximately 1 month long. It's on a cycle of around 28 days. This is going to be a common thing with a lot of reproductive information. It varies. Every individual has their own cycle. There's going to be some variation between individuals. So the ovarian cycle's job is to prepare the egg for fertilization. So get it to the appropriate size, make sure it has a functioning nucleus, make sure that the zona pellicula is of the appropriate size and strength. And then the corpus luteum, the second portion of the ovarian cycle, its job is to prepare the uterus for implantation, to provide that progesterone to make sure that the egg, if fertilized, can implant itself. And then, like I said, if fertilization does not occur, this cycle just resets and we go back to the beginning and start growing a different follicle. All right, so the second cycle is the uterine or menstrual cycle. Either term is perfectly acceptable. And it is partnered to the ovarian cycle. So again, like I said, sometimes they can be used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. They work together, doing different things for the purpose of promoting pregnancy. So the uterine cycle is specifically what is happening to the uterus during the ovarian cycle. And again, there are stages that are going to typically correlate to the various stages that we saw in the ovarian cycle. It can be broken down into 3 specific phases, and I'm going to go through each of those individually. The first of which is the proliferative phase. Now, if you look at this figure, I'm starting kind of in the middle. I think that's the more logical place to start this cycle, but you could technically start it at any point because it is a cycle, it's a continuous circle. So the proliferative phase, this is going to be the beginning of thickening of the inner layer of the uterus. Remember, we have 3 layers. The innermost is the endometrium. The endometrium starts to thicken. We start to increase the amount of tissue there. And because you've increased the thickness of the tissue, you have to increase blood supply to that area. So your body actually creates new arteries that are going to then reach into that thickened endometrial tissue to supply it with blood and nutrients. That's also so that if an egg implants into that thickened endometrium, you're supplying nutrients to that egg until that placenta forms. This stage correlates with kind of the second half of the growth cycle of the follicle. So it's at its just about largest point, but has not yet been ovulated. All right, after the proliferative phase comes the secretory phase. At this phase, the endometrium continues to thicken and gets to its thickest point. So it won't be any thicker past this point. This is the thickest that the endometrium can get. Again, those the arteries continue to grow to make sure that all of that tissue is supplied with blood and nutrients. There are going to be glands that are deposited within this tissue that are secreting glycogen and lipids. These are again going to be nutrients that are going to be essential to that zygote if it implants within the endometrium until the placenta develops. The placenta is going to be the primary nutritive source during most of the pregnancy, but that doesn't develop immediately. It takes some time, and this is how we supply those nutrients to that developing zygote until the placenta is formed. And this stage begins at ovulation. So once the oocyte has actually been ruptured out of the follicle, we begin the secretory phase. If pregnancy is going to occur, if fertilization occurs, it's going to happen during the secretory phase. Yeah. And the third phase, again having to jump back to the beginning of this particular figure, is kind of the reset portion of this cycle. So if pregnancy does not occur, there's no implantation of a zygote, then the body wants to get rid of all that extra endometrial tissue that it created in preparation for a pregnancy. So there are going to be several things that happen. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the hormonal regulation on Wednesday. But it's going to cut off nutrient supply to this endometrial tissue, causing it to actually die off. We've stopped oxygen and nutrient supply to it. It dies off and it's going to start sloughing. It actually starts sheeting off the edge of the endometrium, and that's what creates the menstrual cycle, so the period that females experience. So it's this layer of thickened endometrium that's going to be removed and then bled out during menstruation. Okay. So like I said, it's that menses portion of the cycle that is considered the period. The menses is often associated with discomfort for females. This is not something that's really new. Most people are aware of this. And again, this can be extremely varied depending on individuals and their own particular chemistry. I know people at all ends of the spectrum, people who have very, very little complications during their period, and others that need medical intervention in order to actually be functional during their period. So this is going to be, again, the shedding of that built-up endometrium. This can be painful. The uterus is actually contracting to get rid of that extra tissue layer. And because the uterus is not used to contracting on a normal basis, it can actually get stuck in that contraction cycle, which is what causes that physical cramping that people experience during a period. All of that blood and tissue that's being expelled has to escape. The only way out is out through the vagina. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that one. And then I also threw this in here, premenstrual syndrome, or PMS. This is mostly a hormonal occurrence, and again, completely varies between different individuals. I'm going to include most of the hormonal material on Wednesday's lecture, but during this process of building up the endometrium and then getting rid of that excess endometrium, there's a lot of extra hormones being produced, and this can cause several other physical or emotional changes in the individual, including things like fatigue, increased acne, soreness, and various emotional changes. Again, this is a very general explanation. Not everyone experiences this, and people experience it to different degrees. It typically occurs days to about a week before the onset of menses, so during the secretory phase, this can start to occur. Okay. So the thing about female reproductive cycles are that they are not fertile a majority of their life. We go through this ovarian and uterine cycles, creating oocytes that then need to be expelled and held within the fallopian tubes. And if they become fertilized, then we can start a pregnancy, but they're only fertile for a very short period of time. So if we look at this figure here, we have menstruation, and then you begin growing the new follicle, increasing the size of the oocyte. There's going to be a few days prior to ovulation where the female is most fertile. Then you experience ovulation, and then a couple of days afterwards, and then we begin that cycle all over again. Some people get confused as to why we would be most fertile prior to ovulation. It's because sperm can actually survive within the female reproductive system for several days. And so if they are in place prior to ovulation, they don't actually need to make that distance. They're going to be ready when that ovulation happens, and you can fertilize that egg immediately. Otherwise, if ovulation occurs first, the sperm have to make it through the reproductive system, which is 7-ish inches, which is pretty big for a single cell to make. And that journey can take a couple of days, in which case you may miss the window of fertilization. Now, I mentioned this before on a previous lecture. Humans are unique in that females do not physically advertise when they are fertile. This is something that most other mammals do in some way. It can be physical actions. A lot of animals will undergo something we call lordosis, which is physically arcing and presenting themselves for copulation. I talked a little bit about primates and how there's a physical swelling of the area surrounding the vagina. And these are all visual cues that the organism is ovulating, is ready to be, or is fertile and ready to be fertilized. Humans, we do not have any of those external signals, and so we call this cryptic ovulation. There's no way to physically look at a human female and know that she is currently ovulating. It's interesting if you look at our evolutionary history, though, because all of our ancestors very likely had visual cues for ovulation. We know that because all of our close primate relatives all have that physical attribute. So humans have lost it. At some point in our evolutionary history, that trait went away. There's a lot of evolutionary discussion by anthropologists as to what may have caused that. Most people are of the consensus that it's probably something to do with our mating practices, and that we have more of a monogamous relationship than most other primates, and that may have kind of eliminated the need to physically advertise to all of the males in the area that you are ovulating. All right, so our egg has been created, it has been ovulated, it is sitting in the fallopian tube, it needs to be fertilized. In order to be fertilized, we have to encounter the sperm, the male gamete, with that egg. And this is going to occur through sexual intercourse. So the male reproductive organ must ejaculate into the vagina. The ejaculate is going to be a mixture of the actual sperm as well as seminal fluid. We'll come back to that in a little bit. And like I said, they have to make it through the entirety of the female reproductive system. So it will start in the vagina, pass through the cervix, through the body of the uterus, all the way up that fallopian tube to reach that oocyte that is just hanging out at the very beginning of the fallopian tube. This whole process can take, depending on, again, the individual, a few hours to several days. That's why if a pair are attempting to become pregnant, waiting till actual ovulation may miss the window because it takes the sperm time to reach that egg. All right, like I said, fertilization occurs within the fallopian tubes. It's not at the very beginning, it's not within the uterus. They have to make it through the entire process. This fallopian tube on average is somewhere around 7 inches. I've already mentioned this, but again, a couple hours to a couple of days for this process to happen. Okay. Now, the vagina has its own chemical environment, and that chemical environment is normally considered hostile to most other organisms, bacterium, pathogens, that sort of thing. There's a good reason for this. The vagina is technically an exposed organ. It is exposed to the outside world. There is an opportunity for things to get inside to cause infection. And so the vagina actually secretes its own chemicals that are acidic in nature that are going to help to deter pathogens from coming into contact with the healthy cells. But because the vagina is hostile, it's secreting this acidic chemical fluid, in order for fertilization to occur, we need to change that chemical environment so that we don't kill off the sperm that are entering into the vagina. There are going to be secretions coming from the mucous membrane that lies that endometrium that's going to both lubricate the vagina as well as secrete an alkaline fluid, which then counteracts the normal acidic conditions of the vagina. It's the presence of this alkaline chemical that's going to actually activate sperm and help those sperm to start swimming. So after sperm have been introduced into the female reproductive system, they aren't conscious in any way, so they have to have a way to know what direction to actually swim within the female reproductive system. And so there are a series of changes as you pass through the uterus and into the fallopian tubes of both chemical conditions as well as temperature conditions. And there are receptors on the sperm that can detect those changes, and it causes the sperm to move in the direction of those chemical and temperature changes. It gets warmer the closer we are to the egg, and so it can detect that and follow that as a guide through the reproductive system. Okay. Now, sperm aren't just trying to reach the egg. Obviously, that's the end goal, but they also have to reach that egg before other sperm. There is a competitive element to this. Again, none of this is conscious. This is just chemically based. But a single episode of ejaculation can ejaculate somewhere around a couple 100 million sperm in a single ejaculation. And so that's a whole lot of individual cells that have the opportunity to fertilize that egg. However, only one can fertilize the egg. There are very rare occurrences where two actually reach the egg and fertilize it simultaneously. That does not result in a pregnancy. There's too many chromosomes at that point, and that oocyte will die. So only one can fertilize the egg successfully. Once sperm have reached that egg, they're going to start burrowing through the outer hardened layer. I talked about the different kind of zones of the egg structure. This is the zona pellucida, excuse me. So the sperm comes into contact with this zone. It starts to release enzymes, which will start to actually break down the tissue of this zone. It allows the head of the sperm to make its way through that hardened layer. Once it reaches the plasma membrane of the oocyte, the plasma membrane of the oocyte fuses to the plasma membrane of the head of the sperm. So they actually become a continuous plasma membrane between these two structures. At that point, the material contained within the head of the sperm can be released into the cytoplasm of the egg. Now, there's not a lot within the head of the sperm. Remember, it's just the nucleus, and the nucleus contains the DNA, the genetic material. So it releases all of that genetic material into the cytoplasm of the egg. At that point, this material, what's left of the sperm, disintegrates and gets recycled by the body because it serves no other purpose. Once we have introduced the genetic material from the sperm to the genetic material of the egg, that genetic material fuses. Essentially, the nucleus of the egg fuses to the nucleus of the sperm, and we create a zygote. Once a sperm has successfully released its DNA content into the cytoplasm of the egg, that zona pellucida hardens again. So it's going to actually become impenetrable to other sperm at this point. Remember, I mentioned one of its jobs is to make sure we prevent polyspermy, preventing multiple sperm from fertilizing a single egg. Again, if that happens, it does happen on rare occurrences, that egg is not viable. It will not survive. So once we've had successful fertilization, the sperm has released its genetic material into the cytoplasm of the egg. Both of the nuclei, so the nuclei from the sperm and the nuclei from the egg, are going to enlarge. They're going to swell, increase in size. The oocyte creates a structure we call a mitotic spindle, which is essentially just like a skeletal structure. They're little rods that will then grab onto both of those nuclei and start to shrink, drawing those two nuclei together so that they can encounter each other. Once they encounter each other, so our two little nuclei are brought together, they fuse, they combine their genetic material. Remember, gametes are haploid. They each only have 23 chromosomes. So once we combine the two nuclei together, we create a single nucleus that is diploid. It has a full array of 46 chromosomes. We've created a fully diploid zygote. So if an egg has been fertilized, remember this is still occurring at the very beginning of our fallopian tube, now the zygote can start to travel down the length of the fallopian tube. It is not mobile in the sense that sperm are mobile. Remember, sperm have that flagella, the tail that spins, that actually propels them forward. Eggs don't have any equivalent structure like that. There's actually a very slight flow in the fluid that fills the fallopian tube. So a fertilized egg will just kind of be released into that current, and that will carry it slowly through the fallopian tube. It will reach the body of the uterus, where at this point the secretory phase of the uterine cycle has begun, and it can embed itself in that thickened layer of endometrium. All right, so we are going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the process of the male reproductive system. Again, not quite as complicated. There aren't as many steps involved as the female reproductive system. The goal of the male reproductive system is to facilitate fertilization. It's not to maintain eggs for any period of time or nourish them once they've been fertilized. It's just to deliver the sperm to a point where they can fertilize an egg. And so that's going to be achieved through the process of ejaculation, where we release sperm in combination with other fluids, which we then term ejaculate or semen. So it's not just sperm, it's not just this extra fluid, it's combined together that we call semen. In order for fertilization to happen, we have to introduce the male reproductive system to the female reproductive system. This is going to happen through sexual penetration, which is going to require the process of erection, which is the stiffening of the male penis. An erection is instigated by the nervous system. It's not a chemical reaction, and it's stimulated specifically from the parasympathetic system. Now, you may recall that the parasympathetic system is not one that humans have conscious control over. And so males can experience erection completely unconsciously. It's not by choice. It's not something they can control. They cannot control when it happens or when it stops. This is completely nervous control outside of the conscious realm. There are, of course, external factors that can stimulate this, but it's not something that they consciously control. The process of erection is dilating blood vessels. So all of the arteries and arterioles that are passing through the length of the penis dilate, so they increase in size. That is increasing blood flow to the penis. And if you remember the anatomy, the layers of tissue within the penis, the majority of the tissue is what we call that corpora cavernosa, which is a very spongy tissue. There's a lot of space in that tissue. So when we dilate the blood vessels, all of that extra blood fills up that space, which causes the penis to enlarge and stiffen in preparation for sexual penetration. Now, that's how human males increase the stiffness of their reproductive organ to facilitate reproduction. I'm throwing this in here not because humans have it, but because I think it's evolutionarily interesting. Other mammals, including other primates, so again, historically, human ancestors would have had this structure. There's an actual bone that is within the penis. It's called the baculum or penis bone. And this would have been an additional way to keep the penis erect during fertilization. It is isolated. It's called an extraskeletal bone, so it's not actually part of the axillary or appendicular skeleton. It's separate. It's just in the end of the penis. Females do have a corresponding structure called the barbellum. It's much, much smaller and doesn't serve quite as much of a purpose. In, again, other mammals that have this structure, it's related to both increasing the stiffening of the male reproductive organ, but also to increase the duration of sexual intercourse. This is specifically as a competitive element. Again, females in other species advertise that they're ovulating, right? Males don't want that female to go sneak off and mate with other males during that time period because it's all about putting your genetic material into the next generation. So this prolongs the actual period of sexual intercourse, preventing that female from mating with other males. Like I said, evolutionarily speaking, humans had this. It's been lost, although I was reading in, again, very, very rare circumstances, some human males are still born today with a very vestigial penis bone. And again, we think the best explanation is a change in human behavior. We became a monogamous group. You're not mating with multiple males during a single event of ovulation. So that need to prevent a female from mating with multiple males became less of an evolutionary drive. All right, so in order to maintain an erection, again, because human males only use that introduction of excess blood into the corpora cavernosa, we have to maintain that long enough for ejaculation to occur and fertilization to happen. We then see constricting of veins. So your arteries are dilating, bringing extra blood into the length of the penis, but the veins are constricting, preventing that blood from then flowing out of the penis. So this is going to maintain that erection for a period of time. This is why, if you've ever heard the advertisements for erectile dysfunction, they say things like, if you experience an erection for more than 4 hours, seek medical attention. Because the veins are constricting the blood flow and preventing blood from leaving the penis, this can cause that blood to become stagnant and coagulate, which can then cause damage to the surrounding tissue. It can cause blood clotting. There's a lot of medical complications surrounding this particular process. Okay. So going back to our anatomy, you'll recall that sperm are created within the testes. They are immature at that point. They pass through those various tubules and into the epididymis. As they pass through the epididymis, they are maturing from the head through the body to the tail. By the time they reach the tail of the epididymis, you have mature sperm that are then capable of fertilizing an egg if they were to come in contact with it. So they are capable of being ejaculated. So during ejaculation, the mature sperm that are housed at the base of the epididymis will then be passed up through the vas deferens or the ductus deferens. That ductus wraps up and over the bladder, back around behind it, passes over the seminal vesicles, through the prostate, into the urethra, and then they can be ejaculated out through the erect penis. This process of moving sperm through the vas deferens, as I mentioned, the sperm don't start swimming until they reach the specific chemical requirements present in the female reproductive system, so they're not swimming through the vas deferens. Instead, you may recall peristalsis from our discussion of digestive anatomy. Peristalsis is what I talked about in the esophagus, where the smooth muscle is slowly contracting to push material through that tube. It's the exact same physical process. So the muscle tissue of the vas deferens is constricting to push the sperm through the vas deferens. All right, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just sperm that are being ejaculated, it is semen, which is the combination of sperm and some form of seminal fluid. Most of the fluids that are going to be added to the spermatozoa are coming from the seminal vesicle. So like I said, the vas deferens wraps up and around over the bladder and then kind of passes over the top of the seminal vesicles. While it's passing over the top, these fluids are going to be added to the semen. It then passes through the prostate gland, where more fluids are going to be added, and then out into the urethra. These seminal fluids are going to contain a variety of nutrients and fructose, which is a form of sugar. And these are there to support the sperm, to keep it alive while it is within the female reproductive system. Again, it can take several days before they actually reach an egg. They have to swim through the entire structure. And so they need a way to support themselves for that period of time. And that's what the seminal fluid is doing. It's keeping those sperm healthy and helping them move through the reproductive system. They are also slightly basic in nature, which is again going to help counteract that hostile acidic environment of the female vagina. So the fructose is going to provide the sperm with energy. Once they start moving, they're going to need to expend energy, and then the nutrients will make sure that that sperm survives the weight within the reproductive system until fertilization. All right, like I said, sperm don't normally swim around. They move through the male reproductive system through peristalsis, not through swimming. In order to start swimming, they need to be activated. The very, very beginning of that activation does happen from the seminal fluid. The basic nature of that fluid starts the sperm towards the motility. And then once they are fully introduced to the female reproductive organs where the proper chemistry and temperature requirements are met, then sperm can become fully motile and they start physically swimming, moving their flagella to move through the reproductive system. All right, so like I said, slightly shorter lecture. Basics of fertilization and ovulation. Make sure you understand the phases and what's going on in each phase of the ovarian and uterine cycles. Remember, those are two separate structures, and how do they correlate? So how are they helping each other? The mechanisms of ejaculation, the various glands that are going to be contributing, and what's that doing for sperm and helping fertilization. You do not need to know anything about the baculum or cryptic ovulation. That's just my evolutionary 2 cents. All right, I will see you guys on Wednesday or Tuesday, depending.